All right, we have had a break, and we will have another one for lunch, I promise. I want to welcome you all back. We're going to have a session that focuses on ketamine-assisted psychotherapy and research. And we're really going to be hearing from two people who I think are some of the most prominent and amazing resources, researchers, clinicians, and overall experts knowledgeable in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy in the New York area. So it's a very special treat to have them here. You're in New York, so you get the New York expertise. First, I will introduce Elias Dakwar. Dr. Dakwar is an MD who's an associate professor of clinical psychiatry at Columbia University School of Medicine. He completed his fellowship in addiction psychiatry at Columbia and received a K23 award evaluating ketamine infusions combined with mindfulness training to treat cocaine use disorders. Most recently, he is a principal investigator on several R01s, NIH-funded studies, evaluating ketamine for induction into extended-release naloxone for opioid use disorder, as well as ketamine infusion to facilitate the treatment for cocaine use disorder and alcohol use disorder. I want to point out some of what I think is really special about Dr. Dakwar's research, which is, first of all, that it is an amazing example of actual NIH-funded psychedelic-assisted therapy research. And I know that's just an amazing thing to be able to say that it's happening. So we recently, in the last year, saw the beginnings of some NIH-funded psilocybin-assisted treatment research for smoking cessation, which is also amazing. However, Dr. Dakwar's research goes on for quite some time before that and really uses the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy model. And he combines evidence-based therapies like mindfulness-based interventions with these ketamine infusion sessions, ketamine sessions, and does so in a way that demonstrates the kinds of results that are possible when you do combine empirically supported therapies with these psychedelic-induced experiences in a treatment setting. And I'm heartened always to hear when people are invested in and working towards better and more compassionate treatment for addictions. So I will turn it over to Dr. Dakwar.
Thank you for that warm introduction. So I didn't choose the title, nor did Gita, The Question of Ketamine. But I think it's a good one. I think we should be asking lots of questions, not just of ketamine. We're in a time right now where things are very confused. And I particularly like what Antonin Artaud said about the confusion of his own time. I think it's very relevant to our own, where a lot of our ideas and constructs are being questioned, as they should. And I always encourage questioning the words that we have most in common, including psychedelic. So, question of ketamine, the question of psychedelic, the question of everything. I also started with Antonin Artaud because he represents one of the skeletons in the closet of so-called psychedelia. He isn't celebrated like Aldous Huxley or Hoffman. He was the maniac raging in the desert, trying to annihilate himself with peyote, trying to resurrect a new vision of things. And I think that's a potent example of the European Western mind confronted with these things, one that we should remember. Perhaps more relevant than the person going to Costa Rica and then starting a psychedelic company. So there are some questions we should begin with. Kevin had asked me as the sober Ivy League professor to come and give a dispassionate summary of what ketamine is and isn't. So I think we'll start with some of the things that ketamine has been said to be, but perhaps we should wonder. So this is a multiple choice quiz for everyone. I don't know if you prepared them for a pop-up quiz like this, Kevin, but hope it's okay. So ketamine is an FDA-approved medication for depression. Ketamine is more effective when administered with preparation, guidance, and integration. Ketamine facilitates psychodynamic psychotherapy. Long-term serial doses of ketamine have been shown to be effective and safe for depression and possibly other psychiatric disorders. All of the above, or none of the above? So, as you'll see, all of these are associated with the hype surrounding ketamine. Hype that is very different than the atmosphere I entered into the ketamine research field under. At that juncture, ketamine was the new biological intervention that was being repurposed from general anesthetic to something with unprecedented psychiatric effects. So ketamine, what is it? It's a dissociative anesthetic. Its molecular class is an aryl cyclohexylamine. It's an NMDA receptor antagonist, very potent. It was developed in the 60s as a way to promote anesthesia, but while sparing cardiorespiratory functioning. So without the need for intubation and all of those things, people can be put under in areas that don't have the infrastructure that would be required if it depressed respiration. You can administer it in war fields, in trauma settings. Shortly after its development, some figures came to recognize its potent effects. You all recognize, I hope, John Lilly, one of the great eccentrics of the last century. John Lilly knew he was onto something when, in correspondence with the Earth Coincidence Control Office, his penis was taken from him and then given back in golden form. So ketamine was recognized very quickly as a very powerful medicine. Timothy Leary also was an enthusiast of ketamine, found it to be one of the great psychedelics. And the late, great Jen Breer Porridge also found in ketamine the consummate androgynous molecule that both enantiomers combined created something quite special, and was the fuel for his own pandrogyny, or their own pandrogyny, sorry. So how does ketamine fit into the larger psychoactive world? This is a figure comparing ketamine to some other hallucinogens, MDMA, psilocybin, LSD. And you see that it has a fairly comparable set of actions. And yet, when it was first studied, it was looked at primarily as I mentioned before, a biological intervention. And what was found in 2000 by John Crystal's group in biological psychiatry is that a single dose at 0.5 milligrams per kilogram over 40 minutes, that's the sub-anesthetic range, created robust, rapid antidepressant effects that lasted, as has already been mentioned before, for about a week. This is in the absence of any kind of psychotherapy, any kind of clinical framework. There have been many mechanisms accounting for this effect. The first is the glutamate hypothesis, that there are regions of the mind, of the brain, that are, let's say, characterized by abnormal glutamate homeostasis. So there's a shift in the usual neurotransmission pathways where there's more glutamate than is necessary. This modulation that ketamine provides might provide some support. The next hypothesis is the neurogenesis one, that there's a change in synaptic plasticity that, as was mentioned before, could extend for some period. Other hypotheses, there's change in functional connectivity, the way different regions of the brain connect with one another. It's also been speculated that there's a change in the default mode network, as well as changes in prediction bias. So all of these hypotheses underscore the neurobiological commitments of the dominant paradigm. When I entered into research with ketamine, I was interested in these mechanisms, but also interested in how some of the psychological effects, experiential effects might be relevant. And a lot of my research has focused on that as well. So I looked at ketamine as a facilitator of substance use treatment, looking at various correlates of substance use disorder pathology. Motivation to quit, for example, is often low. There's a lot of ambivalence and demoralization in people who are trying to get treatment. So I looked at whether ketamine 24 hours post-infusion helps with motivation to quit. We found that it does. It also reduces cue-induced craving. We found that it reduces cocaine self-administration, and that it also promotes abstinence in cocaine use disorder patients receiving mindfulness training. Finally, we also found that there was a sustained effect in alcohol use disorder, with patients reducing their drinking, having less heavy drinking days. All of these data, especially in the clinical trials, occurred in a mindfulness context. And in the clinical trials, there was a lot of sensitivity given to the post-infusion period, giving them a great deal of psychotherapy in that period to help move them along. So I mention these trials because I want to emphasize that ketamine has uses beyond depression. There have been studies showing an effect on OCD, on bipolar depression, on PTSD. Its uses extend beyond depression, at least in these preliminary efficacy trials, suggesting, as we've heard before, a transdiagnostic efficacy, meaning it transcends particular diagnoses and may get at some root pathology. I mentioned before that the psychoactive effects might be important and hadn't perhaps been given the attention in the initial wave of ketamine research, 2000 or so. So I was very interested in looking at a hypothesis that characterizes a lot of psychedelic research, which is that the mystical type experience is important. So we first of all looked at the dose dependence of this effect. We found that ketamine at progressively higher doses created a dose-dependent effect on mystical type experience. You can read some of the queries there. That's from the Hood Mysticism Scale, which is commonly used. We also found, consistent with the work with serotonergic hallucinogens, that mystical type experience both correlated with improvement, and in the case of this particular study, it mediated improvement. So these data were taken from the cocaine self-administration study I mentioned. But we've also found it in other studies, most recently in an alcohol use disorder trial. So the experience mediates the effect of ketamine, which means that it's crucial and necessary. And while it suggests that it requires attention and a framework for really harnessing its benefits, we haven't quite done the research yet. We have a study now doing a 2x2 study where we have some people getting therapy, some people not, in a randomized controlled ketamine versus midazolam trial to help clarify this question of whether therapy is important or not. Many of you know ketamine is used recreationally and in some cases can lead to problematic use patterns. So some care is required with it. And I think one of the challenges that I hope to emphasize is that ketamine is not a lone player in all of this. Despite perhaps the title of this talk working to shed some question on, does ketamine really belong with this fabled canon of psychedelic substances. We should be careful to not dissociate ourselves from it, so to speak. It's, and especially because while we say ketamine is in question, there are more data regarding ketamine and more information about rolling it out for widespread clinical use than any other substance currently of this class. So it sheds some important light on the challenges surrounding moving forward with this type of treatment paradigm. Are we going to see the kinds of problems with MDMA or psilocybin that we're seeing with ketamine right now, where certain providers are providing it quite regularly, aiming for that holy grail of the wow experience? We're going to see people who are charging an arm and a leg in order to make a buck, start a McFranchise of ketamine. And ketamine is also, as many of you know, fitting into the wellness industrial complex. We have ketamine spas where you're not referred to as a patient. You're a customer. You're receiving a service. We have these large-scale networks of people operating under dubious clinical frameworks, but with the consensus, so perhaps that consensus lends legitimacy, giving ketamine in ways that haven't been evidence-based, that don't follow from the research. So as I see the field in regards to a lot of these substances running ahead of the research, I think ketamine provides an example of what might happen if that's the case. We start to see people with an entrepreneurial spirit milking the zeitgeist of the psychedelic revolution or whatever this is, and hoping to move forward with very little data to make accessible something that perhaps needs a bit more study, more thoughtfulness, more patience. Oh. I think I was missing one slide there. I don't know what happened. I had a nice K-hole slide. So yeah, I wanted to conclude with the really powerful sentiment voiced by Arturo earlier, that the confusion is our imposing names and constructs on things that we may not fully understand, and approaching it from a place of arrogance predicated on these systems that we regard as somehow privileged and wiser than what came before. So in moving forward, I think attending to the challenges that ketamine has raised, like what happens when we rush with the entrepreneurial spirit, when we are more focused on fitting into existing capitalist systems to do what we can to keep things moving forward and shifting the paradigm through these Trojan horse methodologies. Do we lose something? Do we forget something? Do we obscure the truth of what's before us? So I again, just wanted to raise some questions as Kevin had asked me to, and I hope you found this helpful.
Thank you so much for raising such important questions, not only for ketamine, but for many of us in working with other medicines to consider. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Gita Vaid. She is a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, psychedelic psychotherapist. She is affiliated with the Center for Natural Intelligence, the Ketamine Training Center, and the Chopra Foundation. As a board-certified psychiatrist and psychoanalyst practicing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy in New York City, she is a co-founder of the Center for Natural Intelligence, a multidisciplinary laboratory dedicated to the psychedelic psychotherapy innovation in clinical practice. Dr. Vaid completed her residency training and is on the faculty at NYU Medical Center and completed her psychoanalytic training at the Psychoanalytic Association of New York. She trained as a fellow in clinical psychopharmacology and neuropsychology at New York Medical College and completed a research fellowship at NYU Medical Center. She serves as the Director of Psychedelic Awareness and Consciousness Research at the Chopra Foundation and is on the faculty as a lead instructor at the Ketamine Training Center. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Vaid at our MAPS therapists training several years ago. I believe it was 2016, and so was able to join in alignment and as part of a peer group of people learning some of the first to learn psychedelic assisted therapy for a research setting. And her work continues as providing this ketamine-assisted therapy to the community in a private practice psychotherapy setting. So different from a research setting, but meeting some really unique challenges. And I really look forward to hearing her tell us about what she's working with.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to talk with you today. I'm very excited to be here to talk about my work, my own development with ketamine and psychedelic psychotherapy. I am a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst. I've been in practice for a very long time, 25 years actually, if I consider residency 30. And I've always been very interested in working with individuals to try and get to the root of the problem, to try and see how much deep healing is possible, how much plasticity, instead of just diagnosing and managing symptoms, to try and see how much can we actually help people on a deeper level. How can I use the relationship? And that's why I became a psychoanalyst. But I would say it's only since I've started working with psychedelic medicines that I feel like my work has shifted into me being a healer, where I feel like actually we're not managing anymore. We can actually help people heal and recover. And it's very much a shift in the way I work. And all the theoretical frameworks I've leaned on heavily to inform my work. I really feel like psychedelic medicines offer a developmental model where people can step into the fullness of themselves, the potential to actualize themselves and recover from trauma or obstacles that have been held within themselves. And it very much is informed by this notion that actually we're all perfect, and any diseases or any difficulties encountered are the results of adaptations or compensations that have been provided at the overall cost to the integrity of an individual and their full blossoming. And so it's very much like a plant. I always use this metaphor in my own work and in my mind when I'm working, that when we see a tree that is stunted or misshapen, it's usually a statement of adaptations and the creativity to survive adversities. And when the adequate conditions are provided, I'm always in awe that the inherent potential that living systems possess to recover and blossom into their full potential. And it turns out, in my experience, people are no different. So it's been very exciting to work in this field and really shift the way I'm working. I would say, in some ways, the great theorists who have been working in psychotherapy have been confronting the same issue in different ways. How do we have people unfold their fullest potential? Freud really thought about free association as a way to try and, through the talking cure, have people actualize. And Stan Grof, who is a psychoanalyst recently in his book, The Way of the Psychonaut, has this incredible exposition talking about all the different psychoanalysts, some of the major ones, where they fail, where they didn't go far enough, and really maps out in the most extraordinary way that only he seems to be capable of really recognizing how a lot of those early theorists were correct, even if they didn't go far enough or didn't have the tools that could really open up the cartography of the mind that psychedelics do to allow for really a different access within the self, beyond the frameworks we typically lean on, not just consciousness or the unconscious, but early maps held in the mind and body informed by birth trauma or the transpersonal. And then the question is, how do we upgrade the ways in which we think about these medicines and psychotherapy and using ourselves in creating the correct frameworks to upgrade ways of thinking and working and having better frameworks and tools and better ways of thinking about psychotherapy to really honor what these medicines provide. So that's really how I've been thinking about this incredible revolution with these medicines. And I've been privileged enough to get very well acquainted with ketamine. And I've always been a little bit confused about the relationship people have to ketamine in this world of psychedelics. I'm a big fan of all the psychedelic medicines. Each of them have very different qualities and very different invitations. And my own feeling is ketamine gets a bit of a bad rap, and I'm very protective of it because I feel it's misunderstood. I oftentimes hear ketamine is the only legal psychedelic medicine, and it's a good placeholder for when the good ones come available. And I feel like that's not quite true. I think psychedelics are all amazing, and ketamine is an incredibly beautiful medicine. Actually, I think it offers a lot of advantages over some of the other medicines. I think it might be trickier to use and trickier to work with if you're using it in protocols to try and augment psychotherapy and for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, which is the area I'm most interested in. I think it does require an understanding of what is the invitation that ketamine provides, and how do you help someone prepare so they can recognize that invitation and take full advantage of it. To give you a sense of what I mean, I'll talk about some of the signatures of the different medicines just to compare. In general, MDMA, I think, creates this beautiful environment where someone feels safe and in a love-filled state can really look at themselves and their past with deep compassion to process and understand any parts that have been hurt, wounded, or trauma. And that's very different than the beautiful invitation of psilocybin, which can create this environment to access deep knowledge that is held in the mind and in the body and in the universe, and to see and recognize in different novel ways, access this information. Ketamine does something very different. Ketamine is called a dissociative, but in many ways I think it's not quite the right term, because it's almost like it's a differentiator. It allows one to really untangle from some of the different noises that we carry with ourselves that capture us. When dosed correctly, it's deeply meditative. One can separate and untangle from the mind and recognize, I am not my mind. The mind goes offline, and see and listen to the wisdom held in the body and in the sensual realms, and then untangle from emotional states to not be so governed by strong emotions and feelings, or experiences in the body, to actually realize I am not my body or my physical sensations, and to bring awareness within the self as well as beyond the self. It's a real gift to be able to discover experientially oneself. And it's really through bringing awareness that one can actually expand and heal and listen to oneself. So it's deeply meditative in nature, and then one has the chance to really listen to and understand from other disciplines and other cultures that have been tapping into this knowledge for centuries. How can we think about the knowledge held in those traditions and bring them into the psychedelic space and bring it into psychedelic work? But it's a very different invitation than the other medicines, and very beautiful unfolding. So this hopefully gives you a little bit of sense of the different medicines and how one can tailor it for different individuals. And that's how I work with my practice. I'm very interested in trying to rethink the psychotherapy frameworks and imagine how can I work with individuals and tailor it to the person themselves, not just having these protocols which are generic, which don't suit everyone. We're all so complex. Why would one protocol be correct for all of us? So with ketamine, when someone comes to my office, I really want to understand very quickly what are the paths that have affected them. How has the past affected the current moment? What are the patterns they've recognized? As a psychoanalyst, I want to understand those patterns and where it comes from, and I'm drawn to know every detail and spend so much time delving into the past, using the relationship we have in the present moment to see real time how these things in the here and now play out and shift things. As a psychedelic psychotherapist, that's not so exciting to me anymore. I want to understand those patterns to realize that that is one's prison, that's one's limitation, and more exciting is how can I lend myself to support you from breaking out of those postures, liberating yourself from those patterns, and expanding to new states that haven't been available before. And what's that going to look like in the future is so much more of an exciting question that I want to participate in and support the answering. So that's really a paradigm shift, and it's one that moves towards deep listening and deep recovery and whole health as opposed to just symptom relief. And you can really get very sophisticated with ketamine to tailor it for an individual so one can have a small dose and drop into themselves and then actually follow the person's process and dose accordingly. What I found is if you can tailor it for an individual, words become less necessary because it's more like creating healing spaces, healing within the self and healing within the therapeutic relationship. It becomes more of an art form. Even music and different healing elements in second setting can be used to expand into the experience of healing and creating different environments to access the self, to be heard, to be recognized, to be in resonance. Not much of this probably corresponds to how one thinks of ketamine being rolled out. Ketamine is oftentimes used as an antidepressant and is incredibly effective in high doses or in different doses based on weight and frequency of sessions. And I think that speaks to the fact there are many different applications. I think we need to get really clear on what are those applications and how can we become clearer on where is the psychotherapy, or is there psychotherapy in what's being offered, because I think it's confusing right now to know what is one getting in this work. I also hope there could be more of an interest in psychotherapy frameworks to better hold and go deeper into the process. It's one of the things I've really valued about working with MAPS, is that MAPS have such a recognition of the psychotherapy and the role it plays and how powerful that is in the healing process with MDMA. And I feel it's a beautiful partnership, psychotherapy as well as these medicines, because I really feel we heal each other and we heal ourselves. We're very much independent, and we have healing intelligence, but we're interdependent. I want to talk a little bit about one clinical example before I stop, to share what that looks like. I was working with a young woman, a student from an Ivy League college, who had 2 rape experiences. When she came to my office, after meeting twice, she did a session with me, and she dropped into an experience with a lot of imagery, and she saw her life as a tapestry, and she saw on it these rape experiences as stains on this tapestry. And she immediately spoke to how she saw they were just some marks on her tapestry. There was so much embroidery and stitching and exquisiteness in this whole weaving of herself. Why had that become her center of the universe? Why had that captured her life? After the session, she felt it no longer was. She could see herself in her fullness and could release herself. Her mind was released from that holding. And I think that speaks to the power of this work and how beautiful it is. Thank you for listening.
Let's stay, because we're going to do Q&A.
Oh, okay.
Thank you so much. I'd like to invite Elias Dakwar to come back up as well. And wherever you two are both most comfortable, standing or seated, we'll go into a little bit of Q&A. So I'll start this off, but if people have questions that are sentences that end with question marks that they'd like to ask, please feel free to start lining up at the mic for that. So I had my own question for you, Elias, which was to really ask you, you mentioned so many offerings that are sort of in the wellness model that are including ketamine in less clinically focused paradigms. And yet I know so many patients that are struggling, that are seeking ketamine, thinking that it's going to be helpful for them regardless of the setting in which it's received. What would you say to someone who is, seeking treatment or seeking a ketamine experience for healing their own depression or something along those lines, but may have some sort of difficulty differentiating between why it would be so important to seek it with a medical provider or with a psychotherapist, and why wouldn't they just go to more of a wellness center?
Yeah, thanks for the question. The comment on the wellness industrial complex was intended to underscore the inevitable challenges of iniquity attending these compounds, and the importance, especially given how broadly they can be applied, to have frameworks in place for rolling them out that don't deepen those iniquities. So I'm not averse to people receiving them in non-clinical settings. That's not the crux of the issue. If they're getting healing in non-clinical settings, that's great. I'm concerned about the fact that we're looking to the future and how we are going to roll out MDMA and psilocybin and all of these other things in a manner that's more equitable, while missing the boat right now with ketamine. I mean, we have a medicine right now that could be very helpful, that is accessible, that's cheap, that only requires of us to rethink what it means to be a healing community. Really, that's the primary challenge. And having, these conversations about, wellness versus clinical settings, I think that's missing the point, which is that in both cases, a fraction of the population is receiving these treatments. The first patient I gave ketamine to at Columbia was an African-American HIV-positive sex worker who was addicted to crack cocaine. And I remain very committed to the population that allowed this research to move forward. Most of the participants in all of these trials have been indigent, have been from underrepresented communities, and it makes me uncomfortable when my research is utilized in ways to fund programs that are not interested in serving those communities.
Thank you. Thank you. To somewhat potentially expand on that those programs may not even be set up for, not only not interested in, but also not equipped to, or not able to even accommodate those communities, right? Not having the training or not having the resources to do so. Thank you. Another question for Gita now, moving to the psychotherapy discussion, which is so beautifully laid out for us. You mentioned, being an analyst and training in the talking cure, and there's so many analytic influences in the psychedelic assisted therapy. It got me thinking, though, I wonder how you incorporate people's nonverbal or pre-verbal experiences in the analytically based ketamine work, which is so much based on the talking and the conversation.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Well, I think it actually moves much more into that realm, which makes it so much more interesting, because I feel as an analyst, I can talk and say something clever now as a last resort, but only as a last resort. Because I really feel like it challenges the therapist, and I'm challenged and expanded into what is something I think more beautiful and exquisite, to listening differently, to listening with my whole being, and to hearing with my whole being, and to hearing the communication of the body. And that's more extraordinary, to sort of see how that works. I've had sessions with individuals where the person is lying there talking to me and their mind is chattering, and it's like a split-screen TV. You have the mind going, telling their story, and then the body is moving with mudras and movements of prayers of gratitude. And when I will direct the person to, could they notice themselves and pay attention to the communication of their being, suddenly the field changes. And you can see something else happening. There's an alignment happening. There's a listening. There's a kind of spiritual event, a growth that happens. But I'm hearing and listening to the energy. I'm listening to the person's body. I'm paying attention to the details of what is their body doing. I'm listening to their mind. And what are they saying? Why is it not in sync? And all of that listening, and that just prompting to invite the person into maybe listening as I'm listening, is a very different way of working, but I think it captures the nonverbal and actually the bigger conversation.
Thank you. Let's take a couple of questions from the audience.
Hello, can you hear me? Oh, yeah, figure. I'm an undergraduate from Northeastern. Hello. My question is, how are ketamine practitioners responding to concerns about ketamine's addiction profile and the possibility of patients seeking out ketamine experiences in their own time outside of the clinical setting?
I didn't hear the last part.
Concerns about ketamine's addiction profile, and the second part was the potential of patients to seek out ketamine in their own time outside of the therapeutic context.
Yeah, I think you're raising good questions. I mean, Elias, I'm sure, has a lot to say about this too. I think it's very tricky right now. I think it's very complicated, the ways in which ketamine is being rolled out. And oftentimes I'm not sure when ketamine-assisted psychotherapy is offered, where's the psychotherapy is my concern, or what is the framework or model of mind in psychotherapy that's in operation here? Because oftentimes it feels very light to me. Which might be fine, but I think it's hard as a consumer because some people imagine they're getting psychotherapy and they wouldn't know the difference. And I think addiction is a real concern. I think a lot of, I have a little bit of a concern where you can buy packages of treatment because I feel like there's something a little bit funny as a clinician to me if someone came to me and say, I want to have a package of 6 sessions or I want to pay up front for 6 therapy sessions even. I feel like, even if we've committed to a process, I don't want to assume that we know what the direction is before we're in it. I mean, if I decide after session number 1 this isn't working out, I don't want to be locked into something I've already charged them for. It seems a bit confusing, but I think it gets into who's directing the treatment, or is this a treatment? And I think addiction is an issue because if you're pushing more and more medicines, I think one can get psychologically even habituated to that experience or drawn to a big experience where the value becomes kind of low, I think, in terms of growth. And how is this being addressed? I don't know that it is being addressed, but I think it's important that you're raising this so we're having that question and that thoughtfulness brought to it.
Thank you. Let's take another one.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Just 2 quick questions. I'm one of those sneaky guys. Apologies to the audience. The pain management use of ketamine has identified that the first metabolite, 5-hydroxynorketamine, is really more determinant of patient therapeutic outcomes in a pain management setting. So I'm curious whether either of you, or are you aware of the study of the metabolism of ketamine and how that may have different outcomes in the therapeutic setting for psychological challenges. And I think the other question I have is on toxicity. There is a study that's trying to be done right now at Jefferson University using ketamine for migraine, and the FDA is forcing them to do a bunch of rat studies in order to prove that it's not neurotoxic, and I think all of us here would probably agree that it's likely not, more likely neuroregenerative perhaps. So I'm just curious if you have toxicity data that might be able to be shared.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So the earlier question about metabolite, there were some early studies looking at a metabolite of the R-ketamine enantiomer, hydroxynorketamine, and at least in animal models, was predictive and associated with the antidepressant response. That hasn't quite been borne out in humans, but it's yet another explanation for why ketamine has this prolonged effect. That particular metabolite persists for quite some time. The question of toxicity, the data are equivocal at present. There have been studies with chronic users of ketamine examining neuropsychological profiles, indicating that there seems to be some impairment with persistent use. That is not representative, generally, of how ketamine is given in clinical settings. Pain management settings, however, are, I think, more congruent with that dosing schedule, in that it's given for protracted periods of time, sometimes for 72 hours at a time, arguably at a much lower dose and with a resulting lower serum level, but nonetheless, it may raise questions about the neurotoxic effects of such protracted administration and exposure. But short answer is the jury's out, and it requires further further research. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for those details and answers. I'm sure there is so much more we could unpack here, but for the time being, we're going to call the questions. We're going to thank Elias and Gita for their time and presence, and I'm going to hand the stage back over to Kevin.